So let's talk about CSS selectors a little bit more. And there are various ways to use selectors for CSS. In this course, we're just going to use simple selectors. So like the ones we see here, but of course you can explore some more complex one at your own time. And if you're interested in web development and web design, I highly recommend you do that. So here, all P elements, the paragraph elements of the HTML tags on the page will be center aligned with a red text color. So if you want all your paragraphs to be aligned in the center with and written in color red, now this is not the background color. Background color is another property. And you can look up the properties by the resource I will give you at the end. So text align center, color red, and then looks like that. Notice that the ID selector uses the ID attribute of an HTML element to select a specific element. The ID of an element should be unique within a page. To select an element with a specific ID, write a hash character followed by the ID of the element. So if you remember, we had some tags that had, for example, section or ID. Section or section tag, we have the ID attribute. So equals para, and then maybe this paragraph or whatever it is, or section 1, section 2. So this element here, the one element on the HTML is going to be ID equals para 1. So if we want to modify just this section here, the section of para 1 or section 1 or whatever it's called, we need to add this hashtag here symbol in the CSL rule set to modify only the section with this ID. If we wanted to modify all sections, instead of that, we would write section like we did before with a paragraph. Or if we want to modify one type of section, those with ID equals a certain value, then we need that hashtag there. So it's very similar. Everything else is the same. It's just how to identify the specific kind of tag that we are modifying. So here's an example. We have, okay, so let's focus on this HTML document on the left. Let's focus over here, heading 2. Heading 2, the body begins here. Then heading 2, the ID attribute. Let's see how it's rendered on the page. It's rendered like this, the ID attribute, just a regular, no styling, no nothing. This paragraph, use CSS to style an element with the ID my header. Now notice the paragraph itself also has no special styling. So it's just got rendered regular, very basic, the most basic styling for the paragraph tag. Now, H1 has ID equals my header, and then my header. So H1 has an ID equals my header. And then if you see here, the styling on this one sheet, this is internal styling. It's not external, but it's the same, right? We can just, in the external styling, we just take this and save it into a separate file. So here, I refer to this ID here by the hashtag my header. So all of the elements that have this ID, not all H1 tags, not all H1 elements, but the ones that have ID equals my header are going to be stylized with these properties here. And that's why this looks like this. It's the background, some light blue, the padding 40. Here is the 40 pixel. This is what this means, 40 pixel padding. Text align center, or maybe from the top. Padding might be from the top rather than the I'm sorry, then the left, right might be top to bottom. You kind of look that up on the manual. So the class selector selects HTML elements with a specific class attribute. It's very similar to the ID, but it's just we use the period instead of the hashtag. So to select elements with a specific class, write a period character followed by the class name. So it's the same idea, except some elements usually use class and some elements usually use ID. So the class uses a period and then the ID uses a hashtag. And you can see here Div usually use class. Other elements use smaller elements, usually use ID. But I think you may be able to use ID too, but you can kind of test this out. But div, if you're having a div, usually use class, some other elements will use ID. CSS colors. So there are various ways to provide color values for background text and borders. Often we're interested in colors, so I wanted to talk a little bit about it here. Color values must be provided via one of the formats. So there are various ways to write the color formats. Standardized color names, not the ones you can't just make up any color name like sky blue or whatever. You have to use the standardized ones. RGB plus transparency values, hexadecimal values, and hue, saturation, and lightness values. A number of sites provide the standard color names and the translation of RGB, X, and HSL values to colors we can see. So here's an example. So I welcome and invite you to check this out here to see how this is implemented and the different ways to render different colors. So for example, here we have a HTML document on the left, and we have different variations on how those kind of values, those kind of color values can be described. So here is the if you're doing inline styling, you can just write style equals, but it applies to internal or external CSS as well. It's always the same because we're focused on this part right here. And if you see, they're all different. So the background color is all the same property. We're all talking about background color here, but if you use any other color property, the same applies. So this is the RGB. So how to use RGB? Well, the value part itself, is RGB, open parentheses, and 3 values, which is usually, I think it's red, green, blue, but do I put it here? RGB, oh yes, the RGB, red, green, blue. So red, green, and blue. Now, double check, because sometimes things can be not as intuitive. But that's how if you can use RGB. And then you can use the hexadecimal. So this is kind of code here. And then you can use hue, saturation, and lightness here. So that's percentage. So it's just different ways to get the same thing. If you see, these colors are all the same. So just different ways to achieve the same end. Now, the standardized color name, if you just write red, might not be the same red. So this is the way to be more specific with the tint and the lightness as you wish. Also, hue, saturation, and lightness, is, either way, you can do the same thing with different ways, and you might be more comfortable to use different ones as you see appropriate. Now over here is just add the transparency value. So sometimes you can add transparency as well. So that's like a 4th number for you can see hue, saturation, lightness, and transparency. So if you want to make something transparent, you just add that other value here, and you make sure that you add that you're referring to an additional element as well. So there's the A here, and you can see it just make the red more light. We use the same values, but here we make it a little bit half transparent. That's how we use the color for CSS properties. Padding is important, as I was talking about. So the element has a padding, and the padding is, I think the padding is just from the top to bottom, but I wonder if it also from margin, because I think on the left we're going to use a margin. They're usually going to be called margin, or you can also alignment will bring the text into the center. But if you want to have a padding through the top to the bottom, then use the padding property. Border is the size of the border itself. 1 point solid, and then this color here, this color is probably this green color here. So that's the border itself. 1 point border is how you create the border in the HTML and CSS. Now, all this padding and border and center align and background color, once again, you have to read the manual to know what the available properties even are. So I'm just giving you some of the basic examples here to start working with. CSS property values. Each CSS property may have distinct types of values which must be checked and properly written out. Generally, the values, either text or numeric, do not need to be quoted. The same property may respond to different representations of values. So this gets a little bit confusing, what you have to quote and what you don't have to quote. Now, within the CSS style itself, usually no quotes needed. So if we're dealing with a number, or we're dealing with percentage, or we're dealing with like string text values, you see we don't need to write, because often when we're dealing with values, we need to write quotes, but not within the CSS style itself. And notice that sometimes we can, the height, it goes by point, width can go by percent, but the width can also use points. You can also use pixels here, px, or you can use percentage. So you can use both kinds of values. Background color, once again, you can use the standard color names, or you can use RGB values or RGBAs and so on. Some properties may include multiple values at once. And we kind of saw an example of that here. So the border can have a 1 point, solid, and then this color here, whatever the color this color is, which is probably this color here. Now, not all of them can accommodate that, so you kind of just have to become familiar with how to write these different properties and their values. So far, the information, once again, comes from W3 Schools. This is a very good element. You can browse, you can learn, you can do the tutorials, go through, explore the things you haven't seen. You can also use your favorite search engine like DuckDuckGo to search for more information about HTML elements, HTML tags, but hopefully this will set you on a good path to start working with this material. That's it, and see you next time.